Good morning, everyone. Hope you're all having a wonderful day today. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the BRN-4, which is essentially the HK416 we have at home. Now, before we get into the video, I do need to thank the biggest sponsor of the channel, and that is going to be Callaway Ballistics. Basically, all the ammo that you're going to see in today's video was supplied by Callaway Ballistics, so again, if interested, go ahead and check them out, and if you use code FOCUS, you can save yourself some money. Now, full disclosure on the BRN-4, this is of course a upper that is made by Brownells for Brownells. I'm not sure who's doing the actual manufacturing on a lot of the components, but I have absolutely no relationship with Brownells. I know that they do like to support and work with a lot of YouTubers who then magically give their products very positive reviews. However, I don't have any sort of affiliation with them whatsoever. This upper receiver, as you see it here, was actually sent in by a very kind viewer of the channel who is allowing me to do this review. Now, the owner of this upper receiver essentially wanted to recreate the system that he used in the military, which was the M27 IAR. Now, actually buying a real HK M27 or something similar to that is, one, very difficult to do, and of course prohibitively expensive, and so this was the cheapest alternative. And even the optic setup that we have on here, this is the Vortex 5X prism plus the Venom red dot on top. This is basically a budget version of the Trijicon SDO, which was again the system that he used when he was using his M27 IAR. So for his purposes, this is essentially a recreation of a platform that he is very familiar with, however, like most of us, can't really afford. Now, I say cheap in quotations because the stripped upper receiver minus the handguard and the muzzle device starts at about $1,200 and then moves up, of course, when you finish your handguard. There are different handguards that you can go with. You're probably looking at about $1,600 for a complete upper receiver, which is going to put it right next to PWS for a piston operating system and Geisley and name your top tier DI manufacturer in terms of price. So when we get to the value discussion, this isn't going to be something that I'm going to recommend on a dollar for dollar perspective. This is something that is more of a second kind of cool, if you will. Now, getting into what we're actually looking at here, this is, I believe, the 14.5-inch version, so I am actually going to be pin welding this after the video for the customer, but as you see it here, it's on one of my SBR lowers. Now, there are 4 different configurations that you can get of the BRN-4. You can get different types of barrels and then different length of barrels. I believe there are 3 different barrel lengths. You have a 10.5, 14.5, and 16-inch. You have 2 different contours of the barrel. You have the heavy profile and then the medium contour. This is the medium contour, which I'm very happy with because this is already a very heavy system, and going with a very heavy barrel, it adds up very quickly. Now, the other variation you have is you can go with the nitride barrels like what we have here, or they also offer a chrome lined variation as well. So basically, whatever you're looking for, whatever you're trying to recreate, you can definitely do that. I believe the chrome-lined barrels are a little bit more expensive. But again, this is the 14.5 medium contour barrel, nitride finish, 1 in 7 twist, 5.56 chambering, and as we'll get into accuracy a little bit later on, very, very functional. Moving on to the gas block, this is a self-regulating forward bleed off system, which is very interesting. The gas block itself is double pinned to the barrel, which is perfectly fine because of course we do have a short stroke piston operating system on the inside. Now, the gas block is not adjustable, but it is self-regulating via a forward venting system. So basically, when you're running it unsuppressed, it will act very similar to a standard gas block. It is very soft shooting, which we'll get into a little bit later on. But if you were to add a suppressor, say a resonator K, this does have a lot of additional back pressure. You're actually going to bleed off some of the additional back pressure right out the front and away from the shooter. Now, what that does in effect is it makes the system a little bit smoother to operate. It has a little bit smoother of a reliability curve. So for instance, using purely hypothetical numbers, let's say that if your suppressor that you add to the system adds about 50% more back pressure, with the self-regulating forward bleed-off system, you might only add in, let's say, 20% additional back pressure to the overall system. So while yes, you're still getting more back pressure with a can or whatever else that you happen to be putting on it, however, with that self-regulating system, it is going to bleed off some of that additional pressure, which is nice. So it will shoot better than a lot of DI guns. When you go from suppressed to unsuppressed, there's much less of a noticeable shift there. So as far as the system goes, it is not adjustable, but it is kind of, again, self-regulating, and it does in effect work because I did shoot this suppressed and unsuppressed, Moving back to the upper receiver, this is a custom billet upper receiver, and on their website they do say that the machining marks are much more noticeable, and they certainly are. For being such an expensive component, I was kind of expecting a little bit nicer of a finish on it. However, they do warn you on the website, so it's not that big of a deal. Just not sure if their tooling just isn't set up properly or if it's some other byproduct of the system. While it might look similar in terms of its dimensions to a mil-spec upper receiver, it is definitely not. For instance, the pick rail on top is actually a little bit higher, so it is going to elevate your optics a little bit more, which is probably a nice thing for most of you out there. On top of that, the receiver extension is actually longer, and the barrel extension is also a little bit longer as well, so you actually get more contact between your upper receiver and your barrel, which is going to help us out in the accuracy department a little bit later on. Other than that, standard dust cover, standard forward assist, which in this case both happen to be Strike Industries, and I will proceed without comment. Moving on to the bolt carrier group. This is almost certainly a Superlative Arms or a Adams Arms bolt carrier group. It looks absolutely identical to either one of those, so pick your poison as to who is actually manufacturing it. It is a nitride finish 8620 carrier, 9310 bolt, and has your machined in carrier key for, of course, your short stroke piston system. It seems to be working perfectly fine, so I have absolutely no complaints. Both of those piston manufacturers, short stroke piston manufacturers, I should say, for the AR, have been making decent systems in a AR-15 platform, so again, I really don't have any complaints. If you did want to buy the bolt carrier group just by itself, I believe the price is like $300, which is a little bit more expensive than, again, those other systems that I mentioned earlier. However, there might be something proprietary just to get it to work in this system. Now, moving on to the handguard, and as I mentioned earlier, there are other variations of handguards that you can get. This is the 10-inch version, I want to say. However, you can go with Geisley, Strike Industries, the standard quad rail version, and probably a couple other handguards floating around out there as well. As far as the lockup between the handguards and the upper receiver, that is actually quite good. So of course we have our longer barrel nut underneath, which then has a wedge system on the bottom with a very, very substantial crossbolt. On top, we have a notch cut out into the upper receiver, and then we have an extension on the handguard that then slides into place. This is the quad rail version, which is of course going to be a little bit heavier, but it's also going to be extremely rigid. So if you did want to use this for nighttime applications, you need lasers, iron sights, whatever out front that are going to hold zero, this rail is a very good option for that sort of thing. Now let's go ahead and talk about shootability, reliability, and accuracy. When it comes to shootability, this is still a short stroke piston operating system, which in general is going to be a little bit harsher than a DI-556 AR. However, this is one of the nicest short stroke piston operating systems on the market. I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that the barrels are properly gassed from the factory, and then you combine that with a self-regulating system on the gas block, means you're going to be getting a very soft shooting AR. Not quite as nice as your nicest DI guns, but almost not noticeable to a lot of your standard slightly over-gassed DI guns, if that makes sense. Now, when we throw a suppressor into the mix, I think that it still shoots really well and is actually going to have maybe a slight advantage over a lot of untuned DI systems because of, again, that self-regulating gas block that they have on there. And of course, short stroke piston systems do keep that gas further away from the shooter's face and less on the bolt carrier group on the inside as well. Now keep in mind that the system is also a little bit heavier overall as well, which is going to help, but I do think that this is a very, very shootable upper receiver if you did want to go fast, or even if you wanted to use this on like a full auto application or something like that. I think it could definitely work. Maybe just one slight step behind PWS in terms of their gassing, but certainly not bad by any means. And again, it does shoot very, very nicely suppressed. Now, talking about reliability, this is a interesting conversation. Brownell recommends a H1 or a H2 buffer with a standard carbine spring, and I completely agree with them. Now, what you see here, however, this is a CAC A5H4 system with a much stronger spring, a much longer buffer with the second stage system on it as well that is extremely heavy. And well, it's probably a little too heavy and a little too strong because the BRN-4 did not exactly like it when unsuppressed. Most of the time you would get good feeding, good extraction, all of that, but it would not lock the bolt to the rear on an empty mag. And of course it was just right at that bleeding edge of reliability. So for me personally, I would not run a A5 system on it whatsoever, even if it was a lighter A5 system, because again, this is a H4. What I would recommend is exactly what Brownell's does. I would run a standard carbine buffer, carbine spring, H1, H2, maybe an H3 buffer if you really do want to slow down that system a little bit. And most of the footage you're going to see of me shooting this is actually going to be with a standard carbine spring, carbine buffer. And while yes, the ejection pattern does move up just a little bit, especially when suppressed, maybe about 2 o'clock or so, still fairly decent. And again, you could slow that down with an H1, H2, or an H3 buffer. The only time I would ever run a heavier buffer and spring combo is if you were running it as a dedicated suppressed upper receiver. Now moving on to accuracy, that is another area where I think the BRN-4 does really well. I used 4 different types of ammo, anything from Callaway Ballistics 55 grain reman, all the way up to SIG Marksman 77 grain OTMs. Starting off with the 55 grain remanufactured bulb, that came in right at about 3 MOA, which is about what I would expect out of that ammunition in general. Moving on to some 77 grain SIG Marksman OTMs, that came right in at about 1 MOA, which is kind of what I expect out of that ammunition. That's kind of what it's done in every gun that I've shot it through so far. Then moving on to ADI 69 grain match, which is of course a Sierra Match King bullet. That came in again right at about 1 MOA, maybe a hair over, maybe a hair under. And the last group that I tested was a 77 grain Mark 262 clone from Callaway Ballistics, and that again came in right at about 1 MOA. So again, accuracy fantastic. I don't have anything to complain about in that regard whatsoever. Reliability very good, especially when you're not using a ultra heavy buffer and spring combo, which almost always causes more problems than they fix, but that's a video for another day. And again, the shootability is very good for a piston system. Now, when it comes to downsides, if you've been counting ounces through this video, you know that this upper receiver is very heavy. It is heavier than most 16-inch DI guns, 18-inch DI guns with the 14.5 version that you see here. And if you were to get a heavy barrel version as well, of course, that would skew it even further into the heavy camp. It is a heavy system, and it's also not particularly cheap. Again, the complete rifle coming in at about $1,600 when you're factoring in your handguard as well, which puts it into competition with lighter, more accurate, better shooting DI guns, as well as PWS if you did want to go with a nice piston upper receiver as well. However, I don't really think any of that matters, because I don't think people who are looking at a BRN-4 are looking for the best price to performance to weight ratio that they could possibly get for $1,600, you know, plus or minus a little bit. They're looking at, I would really like to have a HK416, however, I, like almost everyone else on the planet, can't afford an HK416. What's the closest thing that I can get to it? And that's going to be the BRN-4, and it's going to be substantially cheaper than anything else on the market, and it's going to scratch that itch for you. And as a replica or a look-alike, it performs very well, it's very accurate, it's very reliable. Again, I don't have any problems with it from a second cool perspective. The only time I wouldn't recommend it was, well, most of the time I wouldn't recommend it, but if you're looking for the best performance per dollar for weight, it's not going to be the BRN-4, even though it's pretty good. This is going to be for people who are trying to recreate something else, but for a much lower price, of course. And as a second cool kind of thing, absolutely, it's a fantastic value compared to the real thing. But that's about all that I have for the video, guys. Let me know what you guys think of the BRN-4. This is going to be going back to the original owner shortly, and I'm going to be kind of sad that it's not going to be sitting in my closet anymore. So, with all that out of the way, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. I will see you in the next one. God bless.